I'm not quite as tall as Brendan Dunford. But yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And as the title suggests, I'm here to talk about woodland and forest. And to some degree, they're interchangeable terms. But for most people in Ireland, woodland usually means broadleaf trees, and forest generally means plantations of conifers. Now, that's not exclusive division. So I'm going to talk exclusively about woodland. I've just used that term to cover both. And because I know your deliberations are about biodiversity loss, but I also feel, like Brendan, that we need to be positive about what can be done. And so I'm going to talk about recovery as well. So this is the valley in County Wicklow where I live. And I want to talk, first of all, about my experience of woodlands there. Secondly, broaden that out to the national picture and what's happening across the country. And finally, just what are the key issues that need to be concentrated on for restoring our woodland biodiversity. So when I bought a small farm there a few years ago, by fortune, part of it had a patch of old woodland on it, a very old woodland actually, right down in the valley, while the valley slopes are largely devoted to recent productive quick rotation forestry. There are patches of old woodland down in the bottom of the valley, and I'm sure this is quite common across the landscape. And because even though I'd been working as a professional ecologist for most of my career, I knew very little about the practical aspects of management. You know, how do you deal with grazing animals? How do you deal with invasive species and so on? So before I did anything, I invited a whole series of experts to come and meet me there and walk around and talk about it and find out more about this. And what did they find? Well, they found a huge range of biodiversity in this small patch of native woodland. And these are just the groups of animals and plants that these experts studied in a single day. We could call it a bio-blitz. We didn't even look at the more numerous groups, like, for example, the beetles, the lichens, or even the microscopic life, which is under our feet in the soil. So there are there's a huge range of biodiversity in native woodlands, and I want to emphasize that. So I began to wonder, what are the factors that ensure that biodiversity is retained and doesn't disappear? And the first one is the age of the woodland, and this is very important because most of our woodland in this country is recent, and we need to go back and look at the historical aspects. And you can see that even though the woodland waxed and waned over the centuries, 100 years ago it had more or less taken the shape that it is today, and some of the older trees are much older than that. The veteran trees, this is one that's at least 200 years old, an old alder, which is about 1.5 meters across at the base. So this has been here a long time, and this is really important for much of our biodiversity because continuity is a key factor. You can't just plant a tree and expect it to suddenly be covered in plants and animals. It takes time, okay? And the other thing that people often forget is that beneath our feet, the soil is critical, and long-term continuity of soil structure and soil animals and this amazing network of fungal linkages, you know, mycorrhiza is the technical term, which links up the whole woodland, is of critical importance to all the biodiversity there. But there are other features as well you may not have thought about. The age of the age of the trees I've mentioned, and the species, but that needs to be mixed. So you need some young trees coming on to replace the old ones. You need a variety of species that grow to different heights and have different suites of insects and so on in them. And here are just a few examples of some of the tree species that we have. You'll notice not all the trees are straight and upright. Some of them are leaning and others have fallen and so on. Another feature that is important is the presence of deadwood, and that comes over many, many times. Most of our woodlands have very little dead wood in them. Dead and decaying wood is a key habitat feature for many of our insects and small creatures, and as well as fungi, of course. And in this case, where the streams and pools, deadwood needs to be allowed to stay in those as well, because it slows down the flow and it improves the habitat for things like freshwater invertebrates and fish and so on. And we need to think about all those things as well. So I began to wonder, where can we find bits of woodland like this? And as you can imagine, this is not a picture from Ireland, but it's a kind of reconstruction of what Ireland might have looked like when the first people came 8,000 years ago in the Mesolithic. It wasn't wall-to-wall woodland, but of course there were clearings where people settled. Burning may be a factor, and also grazing animals would have opened up areas of woodland. But by and large, we know from the pollen record that most of Ireland was covered in deciduous woodland for most of the early millennia, you could say. The rest is a sad story, I'm afraid. From the Neolithic, when farming was introduced, clearance of woodland began in a big way, or in the Bronze Age even bigger, right down to the formation of the state 100 years ago, when we had about 1% of woodland cover in the country. So a tiny fragment of what was there originally was left. What's there today? Well, in terms of native woodland, the National Survey carried out nearly 20 years ago now actually showed that less than 2% of the cover of woodland in the country is what we would call native or broadleaf woodland. The rest, and it's up to 11% now of the country's covered, is commercial plantation, effectively. And the problem is, as you can see, you can hardly see the spots on the map. It's so small. They're so small. They're highly fragmented and very small. There are very, very few bigger patches. And if we look at a subset of that, you can hardly see the points at all. These are the ancient and long-established woodlands, of which we only know of 123 in the country. And these are so small they had to exaggerate the size of the spots so you wouldn't even see them. So we're dealing with a tiny resource, something that has shrunk right down due to human pressures on the landscape, to a point where a lot of these rare and unusual plants and animals are forced into tiny fragmented areas. And we need to look at how to deal with that, how to respond to it. Unfortunately, many of the fragments are also in quite poor condition. The structure is poor, largely as a result of invasive species like rhododendron, laurel, and so on, which were planted in some of these areas and have expanded, shading out the ground, removing the undergrowth, preventing regeneration of young trees. And the other factor is undergrazing, grazing by both livestock and deer, which is a big issue in terms of woodland conservation in this country. So these need to be addressed and not forgotten about. So on the more positive side, I'd like to look at what options we have at the moment for restoring woodland biodiversity, keeping in mind that, you know, it is the owners and the managers, the landowners, who are going to have to largely deal with this. It needs to be supported from the bottom up, not just the top down. So currently, the best option is the Native Woodland Scheme, and that's a government grant aid scheme which has been operational for almost 20 years now. And it's divided into two elements. The first one is conservation, which means trying to care for and better manage existing patches of woodland. and this will involve fencing to remove grazing from the woodlands or to reduce, to remove non-native plants and animals, and in those clearings that are created to allow natural regeneration from the surrounding seed bank. But it takes time. And if we look at the national picture, there was a target in the last forestry program for just under 2,000 hectares to be grant aided. Unfortunately, there's very low take-up, and only about 14% of that funding was used over that period. And we can see a complete drop-off in up to 2020 in terms of approvals. Now, that had quite a lot to do with licensing as well, but I think one of the main problems is the premia are only for 7 years. And in the lifetime of a woodland, and I've tried to explain to you how long it takes for biodiversity to develop, that's just a blink of an eye. We need to look at supporting landowners in the long term to retain their woodlands, not just for 7 years. What happens after that? Nobody has really come to an answer on that one. The other element of the native woodland scheme is establishment, and here we're talking about fencing. Fencing is probably not sustainable in the long term, but it's the only short-term solution we have to reducing grazing pressure. And planting, of course, planting of native trees. And at this point, I'd say there's a huge groundswell of interest in recent years in tree planting. I'm sure you've all heard of people who want to even plant a tree in their garden, or join an organization that's doing it on a bigger scale. And this is community action from the ground up, and it needs to be coordinated and supported so that trees are planted in the right place, in the right species, and the right soils and so on. So the national situation is a little bit more encouraging there, but we're still only talking about 500 hectares a year being grant aided under this scheme, which is in the context of the rate of biodiversity loss, it's just not adequate. And why is that? Only 70% of the budget has been taken up over the last forestry program for this element. It's because, again, the premiums are so short. If you're a farmer and you are grazing an area of land and you're getting a single farm payment for your beef or your dairy or whatever, and a forester comes to you and says, well, you'll get 650 per hectare for 15 years, and after that you're on your own. And you can't at that point graze it anymore. What's your likely response? I'm going to stick with what I know and business as usual, effectively. And we need to move out of that. We need to get to the point where it's both attractive and supportive of the landowner who, as Brendan said, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm and interest in doing this. It's not the resistance, it's the fact that there isn't support for it. I mentioned deer, and that's a key issue when it comes to native woodland as well as commercial forestry. And deer numbers are just simply reducing the potential for natural regeneration. On the right is a picture of a Scots pine from my own woodland, which has been bark stripped and has died. You can see the stem there has been stripped by deer browsing. But the key issue is it's preventing natural regeneration in our woodlands. And there needs to be a national program of deer control, and we shouldn't get away from that. I'm talking now about introduced invasive species of deer, not our native red deer in Killarney, which everybody, of course, knows is important and should be conserved. So what about some other issues? There is a requirement in licensing commercial forestry for 15% broadleaves to be planted. But the problem is that most of it is treated as an amenity fringe around the outside. In other words, a few lines of broadleaf trees around a big center of conifers. And that's not sufficient because it's essentially like putting a hedge around a field of corn. It's not producing woodland, it's producing a fringe of trees. Scrub also has a great potential, and I'm optimistic that in the next round of CAP we're going to see support for retaining scrub on farms instead of clearing it. This is a picture of a patch of brambles in my own wood with a hazel tree growing out at the top, because the brambles act like deer fencing. They keep the grazing animals out and allows the trees to get above the height of grazing. And finally, I'll just mention this continuous cover forestry, which is actually the norm in many European countries, as opposed to short rotation, clear felling of trees, where a complete canopy is maintained all of the time, or a canopy of some kind, and more light gets through to the ground, whereas the structure of the woodland is greatly improved, and the permanence, the continuity, which we all need. I was at a conference last week of the Society of Irish Foresters, where it was addressed by the Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity, and I'm pleased to say she announced that the new forestry programme, which is due to start next January, is to go to public consultation next week. So fingers crossed, we might find that there are some new measures which fit with what I've been saying to help restore some of our natural forest and woodland biodiversity. But be patient, it takes a long time. Thank you.